Now we're joined by Jason Snead, Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And now this guy is expert in a great many things. I didn't think in the old days that we needed an expert to tell us whether or not terrorists should be able to vote from prison, but that's where we are. That's where 2019 has brought us. Jason, thanks for coming on.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I have a very simple question. Should terrorists and rapists be able to vote?
Well, I have an equally simple response, and the answer is no. Certainly not while these people are serving their prison sentences. The notion, as Bernie Sanders indicated he supports yesterday or the day before, that they should be able to vote from prison regardless of the potential violent or heinous nature of their crime, it ought to incense Americans. These are people who have clearly demonstrated that they cannot abide by the rules of society, and in my judgment, they should have no ability or no say in the crafting of the rules that the rest of us have to follow.
I've seen this trend, forget about voting in prison for just a moment. I've seen this trend among states run by Democrats of re-enfranchising convicted felons. So in a lot of places felons can't vote, and then Democrats decide to allow felons to vote, and all of a sudden they start winning elections, which tells me that my suspicions were correct about the Democrat Party base, but that's neither here nor there. What is the legal basis for this? What is the legal constitutional argument from preventing felons from voting or for re-enfranchising them?
Well, the Constitution implicitly establishes through the 14th Amendment that states have the ability to disenfranchise individuals if they have committed a crime. And so it's a matter of well-settled constitutional law that states have the ability to say, if you are convicted of a crime, that we are going to deprive you of the right to vote, which is incidentally one of the many civil liberties which individuals who are convicted of crimes lose. They not only lose that, but they lose their liberty. They're locked in prison. There are a number of collateral consequences that attach to individuals when they are convicted of a crime, and we more often than not take away their ability under the Second Amendment to own a firearm. So there are a number of civil liberties, not just voting, which states take positive steps to restrict if someone commits a crime. Now, that being said, states, of course, have the freedom and the flexibility to change those policies and to tailor those policies if they see fit. And I certainly believe that there are a number of people who commit crimes, and if they can demonstrate that they have indeed turned over a new leaf, that they ought to be considered for re-enfranchisement. But there is a notion that automatically the moment that you walk out of a prison that you ought to be able to vote, and I think that that's a trend in the wrong direction.
And it just seems totally unhistoric, and it seems totally anti-constitutional. There's nowhere in the Constitution, as you say, that says that convicted felons need to be able to vote the minute they get out of prison, or I guess in the case of Bernie Sanders' proposal, need to be able to vote while they're in prison. Do they forget that when you're convicted of a felony, you can lose your Second Amendment right? Your Second Amendment, it's right up there at the very top. If you can lose that liberty, a civil liberty guaranteed to you by the Constitution, why is the vote so important? I wonder if this gets to a sort of legal bizarre theory that's gone around in the last few years, and an ideological construct, which is that the vote is the most important thing. I remember when I was a kid, Puff Daddy threatened me. He said, if I don't vote, I'll die. Vote or die. I've got to go rock the vote. Doesn't matter who you vote for, just that you vote. There's nothing more important than voting. Where does this come in history? I always thought that the vote was intended to give us a good government, to protect our liberties, to allow Americans to flourish. Now it seems like that's flipped on its head. It seems like our whole government structure just exists so that people can go to the ballot box once every couple of years.
Well, I think that there has certainly been a trend towards that in the last few years, and I think that there is a crass political calculation which candidates like Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris are making, where even if they're not, directly playing for, we'll say the criminal constituency, right? If we took Bernie Sanders' pledge that he would want to let people vote from prison, but that they're certainly playing up to a base which believes in the problems of what they call mass incarceration, and I think that is the angle that they're going for, and I think that this this is going to animate particular communities, which they have been leveraging the argument for years now that these are communities which are being, in many cases, to use their own words, terrorized by police, and that there is, again, a mass incarceration problem. So I think that there's certainly some interplay between those two arguments. But you're right. Lately, in particular, when we're talking about in the criminal context, the deprivation of civil rights and civil liberties, often the only one that particularly the animated left wants to talk about is the right to vote. And I really do not believe for a moment that Bernie Sanders would say with equal vigor, equal firmness, that someone who has been convicted of a violent crime, someone who's a convicted terrorist, should be handed back their firearms the second that they walk out of prison. And so until they're willing to do that as well, then I think that we need to see this for what it is, which is a crass political play.
Absolutely right. This is a crass political play. It's kind of ironic, too, because they think that by saying that the Boston Marathon bomber should vote, they're going to win the narrative on mass incarceration and prison reform. They seem to forget that President Trump signed a major prison reform bill that let a lot of people out of prison not 6 months ago. President Trump has actually made significant policy moves in many ways that angered conservatives on this. I just wonder where the policy questions go in 2020. You've already seen people walking back these statements. The co-chairman of Bernie Sanders' campaign just went on TV and said, well, maybe not the Boston Marathon bomber. Well, maybe that's a little too far. Kamala Harris, within one day, she said, yes, we should have the conversation about letting people vote from prison. Within one day, she says, I don't want people to vote from prison. And it's not just on this issue of terrorists and rapists voting in our elections. It's also on the Green New Deal. It's also on so many other questions that the Democrats have been bringing up. They all seem to want to out-liberal each other. They all seem to want to go a little bit further to the left than the other guy. These policies are profoundly unpopular with the American people. Is there any way that one of these candidates can win the primary for the Democrats by embracing these left-wing policies and still win the general election?
Well, after 2016, I'll say that there's room for anything, right? I mean, I think that there were a great many people who were surprised with the outcome in that election. I do think, though, that if this is the direction and this is the pace at which all of the candidates are running to the left and the Democratic side of the field, then they're already this early in the process at the point where they're advocating for terrorists and violent criminals to be voting, and not long before this, they were saying that we need to empower 16-year-old teenagers to vote, and they're still talking about we need to eliminate the Electoral College and we need to pack the Supreme Court. It hasn't taken them very long to get to where we are, and so certainly if they continue to run in this direction at the pace that they're going, I think that they're going to run smack dab into a pretty hard wall when they find out that most of the United States is not on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And so I certainly hope, at least, that when people hear what these candidates are saying, that they are pulling back and that they are asking some tough questions of these candidates in terms of what they actually want to do when they're governing. And I think that this is indicative of where a great many of these candidates and a great many political leaders in the Democratic side of the field are right now, and that should be troubling.
President Trump has this amazing ability to drive his opponents crazy. I've just noticed this over time. He drives them, as you say, to run headfirst into a brick wall time and time again. And what I want to know when I see them endorsing policies like the Green New Deal, $93 trillion in cost, eliminates planes, trains, and automobiles, kills all of our poor little cows, absolutely radical stuff, proposes knocking down and rebuilding every building in the country within 10 years, obviously letting terrorists vote. When I see these radical policies, are they embracing them? Are they running to the left? Are they running into that brick wall because of Donald Trump, because they have just been, they're so wound up and angry and they hate him so much that he has caused them reflexively to move to the left? Or are they moving to the left because this was always baked into the cake of their ideology, and they have moved further to the left over the last 20, 30 years, and this is simply the logical conclusion of the ideology that they've embraced?
Well, I personally tend to view the election of Donald Trump as being something of a catalyst that perhaps has expedited this leftward shift. But certainly, I work at a think tank. We deal in policy more than politics. And certainly, if you look at the policy arguments which have come out of the left over the last number of years, they have been getting progressively more, the word you use is radical, and I think that that's absolutely correct. And so I do think that there has been a movement to the left that predates the election of Donald Trump and actually goes back into the Obama administration years. But I do think that being said, Donald Trump certainly had an impact, certainly had an effect, and brought a lot of voices into modern liberal progressive politics, and a demand from them that really doesn't leave a great many politicians a lot of room to maneuver in terms of how vociferously they have to oppose Republicans, how vociferously they have to be in favor of ideas like the Green New Deal, because if you want to win the presidential primary, as you said earlier, everybody is trying to out-liberal one another. So I do think that this was a natural trend, but I think that Donald Trump has expedited it.
That's true. Donald Trump, as maybe a characteristic of our age, we don't have a lot of patience. We want instant gratification. We like reality TV. We want a tweet every 3 seconds. So that attention span, I agree with that. He really speeds things up now. And I guess it's another instance where we can say thanks Obama, because everyone focuses on Trump. But as you say, these things really did start to accelerate during the Obama years, where you saw progressivism really take over the policy proposals of the Democrat Party. Jason, people can find you at Jason W. Snead on Twitter. You are a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. I got to tell you, I steal from you guys shamelessly. I am always using Heritage analysis in my show and in my writings. So where else can people find you?
Well, I encourage everybody to go to heritage.org to see my writings, and occasionally I pop up in other publications as well. Absolutely.
Jason, thank you so much for coming on, helping us to explain why terrorists should not vote. Can't believe we have to explain that these days, but I appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.